Now I'm going to teach you how not to draw an eye. We place a lot of importance on eyes because, of course, that's where we look when we talk to a person. And eyes are one of the most fun things to doodle and one of the most common things I see doodled on my students' papers. But typically when I see someone drawing an eye, even if it's beautifully shaded and very cool, it's kind of the average eye. It doesn't really look like anyone's eye in particular. And that's because over time, the more eyes that we see, we kind of form an average of that eye. So let's talk about how to draw an eye that actually looks like the person's eye you're trying to draw. And remember, it's just all shapes, wiggles, lines. As long as you put them together in the right spot, it's gonna turn into an eye. Let's talk quickly about anatomy. And remember, you don't need to know this super well because as long as you're slowing down and drawing what you see and not what you know, all those value shapes are gonna come together and they're gonna create an eye. But just so you know what we're looking at, let's go over it really quickly. Our eye is a sphere that sits inside an eye socket, so it should be shaded like a sphere. Just like we did on the value pages earlier where you applied shading, not often is the white part of the eye actually white. Next, you have the colored part of the eye, which is an iris, and inside the colored part of your eye is your pupil. And your pupil actually changes sizes. So even though you might be drawing and you get to that dark point of the eye and you think, I know what a pupil looks like, don't shade it in quite yet. Really look at the photo reference and figure out how much light was in that room at the time, meaning how big was their pupil. As an eye turns away from us, it also might not be a perfect circle, but more of an ellipse, which is a circle on its side. The brow sits in the eye socket, and on the top of the socket we have the eyebrow, and on the bottom we usually have a value shift there, so make sure that you're looking out for where to put those value shapes. Let's talk about the most common drawing mistakes that you can make while drawing an eye, and let's look at the photo references to do it. On the very top of the page here, we have a bad example of an eye and we have a good example of an eye, and I want to show you what the differences are between those two. On the left is our bad example, and the first thing to notice is that there's way too much white space shown within this eye. We tend to draw eyes really big because we think they're really important, and they are really important, but they're not actually bigger on our face. They actually take up a pretty small area of our face. My biggest personal trick to drawing an eye is to draw the triangles of the white space on either side of the pupil. And from there, I kind of branch out and get the lids, all the creases and the value shapes, and it ends up looking a little bit more like their eye rather than an eye. Not very often do you see white space on the top and the bottom of an eye. Sometimes you can see it a little bit on the bottom, but the only time you see it over top of the iris is if somebody is very surprised. In this reference here, you can see that this person only has a little bit of a triangular shape of white space showing, and only a little bit of that space is actually white. The rest of it is shaded, because again, remember that the eyeball is a sphere. And on the left, we just see a hint of that probably 3 or 4 value there. It's not really white space at all. Note that the top of the eyelid is usually a little bit more curved than the bottom. Sometimes people talk about it in 3 lines, going up the eyeball, going across the eyeball, going down the eyeball, whereas the bottom of the lid goes a little bit flatter across. You also can't forget the tear duct, which is kind of gross looking, but a very important part of the eye, and it really changes the shape. So this dark shadow that we're seeing right here is the tear duct, but you can think about it as it almost looks like an alligator's mouth open. You want to include that as part of the eye because that's showing how the shape is tilted towards the nose. Also note that this giant value shape right here is showing that there's an eye socket and that the eye is set back into the face, not sitting on top of the face next to the nose. The eyebrow too lives on the brow ridge and is an important part of the shape of the eye. People tend to make the eyebrow a little bit too defined, but really think about it as a shape. That's a pretty dark shape with just some individual hairs at the end. Don't try to draw every individual hair. While we're speaking about hairs, let's talk about eyelashes. People tend to draw eyelashes super defined, and you can see that in the bad example on the left. Often, we can't actually see individual eyelashes except for a couple little spare ones. We should really try to draw them as a big block shape or as individual little triangles. Let's look at the next example. I really wanted to include this one for you because it's looking at an eye from the side. Can you guys see this big value shape that's happening right here? So that's actually the tear duct curving around the shape of the nose. This is one of those moments that it's more important to draw what you see than what you know. You don't really have to have all the information happening within that shadow. As long as you draw that shadow shape, you're gonna draw an eye that looks like this eye. Make sure you also note that the eyelids have thickness, so the eyelashes aren't sitting directly on the eyeball. You should be able to see a little space between the iris and where the eyelashes start. And remember, don't overemphasize the eyelashes. There's just a couple little dark marks there to show where they are. The last example on the page I wanted to include because it shows a woman looking towards her nose. And I know that we know there's white space on either side of the iris, but you can't see it here, so I don't want you to include it. Remember, draw exactly what you see. Over towards her tear duct, that shadow shape actually intersects with her eye and becomes all one giant shape. I know we know that there's a difference there, but if we can't see a difference in the photo, there shouldn't be a difference in your drawing. I filled out the first example for you, and I want you to go ahead and fill out the next two using the photo reference in the middle. Remember, if you're feeling intimidated, flip your book upside down to help your brain disassociate from what it's drawing and just see those value shapes as well. When you're all the way done, go ahead and flip to the next page where we're gonna learn how not to draw mouths.